Advocacy and Outreach. I'm Marwa Mohamed, Head of Advocacy and Outreach at Lawyers for Justice in Libya, and I'll be moderating this event today. This event is being recorded. So without further ado, let's get started. On 27th of February, the Special Representative for the Secretary General, the SRSG, Bathily, announced a much anticipated new political roadmap for Libya to hold the postponed elections after years of uncertainty and frustration. But this is not the first time we've seen a promised political roadmap that brings elections. And the divisions that would bring in the elections and end the divisions and place the country on the road towards democracy and stability. In 2015, we saw the UN-led SRSG agreement that also promised the end to the political division by installing the government of national accords as an interim government that actually remained until 2021. This only divided the country even more and eventually led to the attack on the capital, Tripoli, in 2019. The 2021 Libyan Political Dialogue Forum was a result of the Berlin process and brought about a ceasefire and another interim government, the government of national unity, with the promise, again, of elections to be held in December 2021. Yet here we are in 2023 with the same questions of legitimacy and no elections. There still remains the questions of instability, but today we have the promise of a new process that we hope once again will lead us to elections and ultimately put Libya back on its path towards democracy. The new plan presented by the SRSG is set to convene a high-level steering committee aimed to get us to elections by the end of this year. This committee will seek to bring together roughly 30 individuals from all factions within Libyan society, from key political players, but also to include Libyan civil society. This is not the political dialogue forum that we had in the past. This is meant to be more inclusive. However, many of us remain skeptical, to say the least. We have seen these attempts before. So the question is, what is different this time? Have we taken lessons learned from the past, and what can we expect this time around? And here to help us unpack all of this is our great panel today. Allow me to introduce our panel, Ambassador Caroline Hurndall. She is the British ambassador to Libya. We have Emadeddin Badi, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Atlantic Council. Hanan Salah, who is the associate director for the Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. And last but not least, Tarek Megerisi, Senior Policy Fellow with the North Africa and Middle East Program at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Thank you all for being here. I thank the panel and our audience. I'll start with the first round of questions. And the first question I will address to Caroline. What is Bathily's initiative? And how is this different to other attempts since SRSG in 2015?
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me on this panel. It's a great opportunity and an honour to be with such wonderful colleagues. It's a good question. So, and I think actually the answer to the two halves of your question are almost the same, in that I think SRSG Bathily's initiative seeks to address some of the lessons learned and some of that well-trodden path that this seminar is named after. In that, he is seeking to convene a broader selection of Libyans to address not just the legal challenges and requirements for election, but a much broader set of problems. So let me expand on that a little. He's obviously announced this high-level panel I think the exact makeup of it and what it looks like and when it meets, to be frank, is still to be determined. And I think he's said that publicly himself, because he's seeking to be flexible and responsive to what's happening on the ground. But what we have heard from him is that there will be groups within this panel trying to bring together the right collections of Libyans who have voices that need to be heard, for example, in looking at the security requirements for elections, a code of conduct, what is required and what is the power sharing agreements after the elections. And by power sharing, I mean legally, what are the different powers of each institution. So I think broadly that's aimed at trying to expand the consultation to build a real consensus. Because I think what he's trying to do is address the problem that whilst they retain a role, the House of Representatives and the High State Council don't have sole ownership over the many issues that need to be addressed in order to see successful elections take place. So as I said, I think his initiative is characterized by those two principles, by broadening out the participation so that there is more political and security consensus around a plan for elections and what happens after. And as I said, a process that doesn't just focus on achieving an electoral law, because I think for us in the UK, that is one lesson that we absolutely need to have learned from past processes, is that if it only focus on just getting the legal requirements in place for elections, you might very well get to election day, but that election could in fact be quite risky without the political consensus and some of those agreements built, so there is clarity and confidence about what happens afterwards. I think the timing of this is quite important. I think the other reason that Bathily has announced this initiative now is because perhaps compared to a couple of years ago, from where I sit, we see much more international consensus around Libya becoming more about the need for Libya to become more stable. And more cooperation between the different members of the international community that care about and have an interest in Libya. And having been based here for a while now, I don't pretend to overtake the experts on this panel, but having lived here in Libya for about a year and a half now, it really feels here from the friends and colleagues I speak to that actually there is a real desire to try something different and move forward. I think the final thing I'd say is there is still some uncertainty about how exactly this will be put into practice. I think if I'm honest, that's because the SRSG is trying to learn the lesson of being flexible, respond to events on the ground, and listen to Libyan voices. What that can mean is it feels slightly less certain. I know that I'm trying to check my desire to see a perfectly written out timetable plan, because I think what he's doing at the moment is consulting both senior Libyan politicians, political parties, civil society groups, now that he has announced this overall intention and the principles behind his plan of exactly how he puts meat on the bones and puts it into practice. I'll stop there because there's probably going to be questions, but back to you.
Great, thank you, Caroline. Thank you for your intervention. My next question I'll direct to Tarek. And building on what Caroline had mentioned in terms of the international community seeing a lot more consensus today than we've had in the past, which could potentially be one of the differentiating factors from past experiences. So my question to you would be, what are we to expect from the international community, particularly within the next 6 months? And to ensure that commitment towards elections actually works.
Thank you, Marwa. You gave me the easy question. Huh? Look, what can we expect? I suppose we'll find out over the next 6 months. But you know, in your introduction, you laid out how this is all quite repetitive, and so I think we'll see a repetition of some of the same behaviors that we had before. I mean, Caroline was correct when she said that there does seem to be a greater degree of international cohesion than there was before. From all of those who are actively involved in Libya, I can only see one country that is kind of outside the fold of trying to, or of being enthusiastically behind Bathily and the UN process, which is definitely a positive. But in terms of what can we expect and what that means, I worry, and I hope Caroline will correct me later on, but I worry that it means that we fall back into these old behaviors of, everybody saying, well, the UN has a plan, the UN is going to deal with it, we support the UN process, and there not actually being much tangible examples or add-ons to what that support for the UN process entails. I mean, we've seen the UN come in before very confidently, announce a plan, kind of get caught up in the mess of implementing it because they don't have the capacity, the capability, or the information required to do the job correctly, and then the plan kind of slowly unravels over time. And I think we've gotten to the stage where the Libyan elites, for want of a better term, the politicians who already sit in power, are actually pretty good at playing this process and knowing how it's all going to unravel and playing their cards accordingly. So I expect, unfortunately, to see something similar to what we saw before. A lot of words of support. I would hope that we see something a bit more than that. As a think tanker, I got to give policy recommendations whenever I can. So trying to add some expertise to the UN panel, trying to work around the edges of the process diplomatically, to kind of put pressure on these politicians and field marshals and others to play ball and to not spoil the process, and to help move the process along. So hopefully my cynical expectations will not come to fruition, and instead these wonderful policy recommendations will all be eagerly picked up. Thank you, Marwa.
Thank you, Tarek. I have so many follow-up questions to that, but I'll hold off because I want to move next to Hanan, who will hopefully give us some insight on the realities on the ground in terms of obviously the human rights situation and civil society. So Hanan, there is a lot of talk about the inclusion of civil society being an integrated part of this initiative. What does this look like when in reality we have now seen the most severe crackdown on civil society since 2011? And how does this then play out with these realities on the ground along with the general human rights situation?
Thank you so much, Marwa, and it's really great to be on with everybody. Just a quick response to the ambassador, and maybe a little bit agree with a bit what Tarek said. Even if I'm extremely creative, I'm having a very hard time to envisage what this UN plan could possibly look like. But the one thing that is really clear to me is that the parameters for this initiative remain the same, and they remain the same as they have for all the past political talks, which is, a de facto policy of appeasement where everybody who is in charge of some part of the territory, and there are a few, I mean, there isn't one group that controls, the major part of the country. So having all of these people come together and, pick someone who, will sort of seem agreeable to the biggest part of the people. I find it interesting that those people, somebody called them the political elite, but again, I have a hard time envisaging that. They have lost really they have lost, let's say, their constituents. They have lost the confidence of their constituents, but it seems not really of international actors. And the situation of civil society being an integral part of any elections that are in any way, shape, or form free and fair. And the GNU, which is the Government of National Unity, is about to obliterate civic groups in Libya with a recent legal opinion that is not just highly questionable, but, in my view, is probably wrong. that effectively nulls and voids every NGO that was established post-2011. That includes charities, that includes all groups, not just groups that do work like Human Rights Watch and expose, violations in prisons and name commanders of militias, but, do the very important grassroots work that is so necessary. It's a young and budding civil society that really started to grow after 2011, work on people with disabilities, women's rights, work on political rights. All these issues are now being cut because the government has decided really to scapegoat NGOs for, all the issues that it faces. There are members of civil society currently in detention for peaceful activism or just for working for international NGOs. So this is really intimidation and has a muzzling effect on speech. And after months of fear-mongering about all the possible agendas of foreign groups in Libya, foreign NGOs, meaning everyone working in development, working on humanitarian issues or human rights groups, are really now unable to access Libya, which presents us, but also presents those NGOs that are implementing partners of the United Nations, implementing partners of the European Union, who do vital humanitarian work in Libya, are really prevented by the government of national unity to even enter Libya and to do this vital humanitarian work. So I think that is a very big question, that if this very basic work can't be done, then, how are you even starting to think about groups that will be there once there are elections? I think there's just a couple of more things to mention here. There is a situation, especially in Tripoli, with a civil society commission, which is the body responsible for registering NGOs, that has been actively driving a campaign against NGOs, all civic groups, not just foreign groups that could come in with a foreign agenda, but really all groups, local groups and charities included. And here I would like to make a direct call on any diplomats, including the ambassador who's with us on this panel, to really take this forward to the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Minister. We have addressed the SRSG, the UN SRSG, to intervene really on behalf of civic groups, and we expect to see a little bit more support to NGOs, because really what kind of partner is the government of national unity, the government that is representing Libya in all international fora, be it the African Union, be it the League of Arab States, be it the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, when, if you put it into context, it controls Tripoli, yet it represents the entire country in all of these international fora and is currently blocking efforts of any kind of scrutiny. With representation also comes responsibility for the entire country, and I don't think that message has sunk through. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer more questions, more elections-related questions.
Thank you, Hanan. I think that transitions us quite neatly into the next question, which I addressed to Ahmed, Hanan mentions the realities on the ground, the crackdown, the detentions, the arbitrary detentions. There are factions on the ground that are carrying out these crackdowns, and they are essentially a key factor into what we expect would lead us to that path to stability. So my question to you, with this reality on the ground, what measures or steps are taken to ensure the buy-in from all the factions, including the militias and armed groups, into this process? And what guarantees are in place that will prevent a 2014 outcome? As you know, the results were contested and civil war broke out. So what measures are put in place to prevent this, contesting the election results that could potentially also lead to another civil war?
Right, that's not an easy question. The short answer, I think, would be at this stage, I don't see any really meaningful steps having been taken to safeguard the process, but more importantly, as many of my co-panelists in their interventions highlighted, it's not clear what this process is and what competitively differentiates it really from the past processes, particularly the 2020 Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. It looks like a redux of that, but with a few tweaks or a little bit of vagueness to it. That's the cup half empty view. Now I want to zoom out a little bit to address your question and look at the timing where this is all coming in, because yes, we've had similar processes since 2015, 2020, etc. But this particular process is now coming at a particular time. You have the maturing of really popularly illegitimate political, armed, and criminal networks. You have unprecedented levels of foreign interventionism, nothing like what existed in 2015, nothing like what existed in 2020 today. A population that has grown completely apathetic, either because of conflict fatigue or deprivation of rights or failed promises by politicians, etc. And to round the picture up, like Hanan pointed out, now you have a civil society that, yes, has been institutionally cracked down upon. It was never really easy to operate in the civil sphere in Libya, but now is legally made almost unlawful across the country. And this is something which the political elite, yes, appears to operate in a fragmented way. Yes, they have their differences, but across the board, they are institutionally cracking down on people. What made me almost a little bit laugh yesterday, but maybe this is a bit tragic, is the tweet by I think the US embassy, which highlighted that they were mediating to support the conversions of views between the different political stakeholders. And I think their views are quite converged already in that they don't want elections. They've highlighted this in their different ways. Yes, they disagree in their public speeches, etc. But behind closed doors, everyone really doesn't want elections, neither the PM nor the HSHO. And unfortunately, the initiative or the contours of the initiative that Bathily outlined really is handing the reins of the new high steering panel to those stakeholders. Now, the critical point for me was between the briefing of the SRSG in New York and his presser in Tripoli, because I think in between those two, the political elite was actually quite apprehensive. And after the presser in Tripoli and essentially the capitulation of the UN to the status quo forces, the HOR, HSC, and their 6+6 committee, they really had a sigh of relief. They're very happy. They're almost overtly victorious, whether it be offline or online. And it's unfortunate to see that that's the path that's now being taken because of the timing that I mentioned earlier, because of the degree to which these networks are now mature. Now, on specifics of the initiative itself and the measures, I'll outline just some thoughts that I had based on what was publicly said. And I must admit that some of the contours of the initiative are still very confusing. But one of the kind of entities that was recurrently mentioned in the speech of the SRSG in New York was the 5+5 GMC, the Joint Military Commission. And it's even almost romanticized online how patriotic this entity is, etc. My worry is that the modalities of inclusion of this entity in the political process or in the panel or the dialogue forum, whatever you want to call it, undermines really the principle of subordination of the military to civilian leadership. And the fact that it will be included with other actors in the same room to effectively negotiate the path of the country forward really is a setback on that front. And in particular, you already have a muzzled civil society without having armed groups present with them in the same room. Imagine putting them to negotiate the country's path together. On the other, now behind the process and the structural fallouts of it, etc., there's been a backdoor dialogue that I think has been almost very clearly cultivated by Western Libyan armed groups with the LAAF. And I think that was a missed opportunity. That was a missed, sorry. I think that was not very much factored into the political process and factored into the current timing of things. Because from my perspective, this dynamic or ignoring it has really allowed, on the one hand, the Western armed groups to significantly mature and get involved in politics the way they are now. And on the other hand, it has enabled the hereditary transition on the side of the LAAF, with now the sons of Khalifa Haftar effectively almost overtly taking over. I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can discuss more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. So what I'm to understand from that is that nothing no steps have been taken to ensure that kind of buy-in.
As of yet,
Back on a few of the points. Sorry, Emma, I didn't realize you'd finished. If you haven't finished, please carry on. Otherwise, there's a few points.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, Caroline, you wanted to.
Well, not specifically on Ahmad, on a few of the points that have been made. Sorry, I thought you were rounding off. Please give Ahmad the chance to finish.
Ahmad, did you want to follow up?
I was effectively done. I think there's nothing else to say except maybe on the foreign interference side. I think the alignment behind the SRSG's initiative, there are a few well-meaning actors that really want this to work. I think on the other hand, that there are some actors that are cosmetically aligned, and the alignment is artificial because they know that this plan will fail, like they did know that in 2021 as well. And I think there are other loud actors throwing diplomatic tantrums that are very much overtly against the initiative. And if Egypt, for instance, I'll effectively mention Egypt because they were very overt in their jubilation once the reins were handed over again to the HSE and the HOR after the presser. So yeah, that rounds the picture a little bit.
Thank you, Ahmad. Caroline, I'll turn to you if you want to.
Thank you. As you encouraged, I just wanted to come back on a few of the points that have been made because I think they're really good and very valid. Firstly, on Hanan's entirely correct to raise the deeply concerning, I sound like such a diplomatic robot. It's awful what we're seeing happen to civil society and the challenges they're facing, the clampdown they're facing. And I suppose on that specific point, I just wanted to reassure that we absolutely are raising that with the Prime Minister and everyone below him. And we're working with international colleagues to see what we can do to unwind some of those really just horrifying decisions, and the way civil society space is being reduced is greatly concerning. And that kind of leads me on to the other point, because a few people have mentioned how this process seems to be just a repeat of others, giving all the power back to the so-called elites. I think I really wanted to stress that I think that's exactly the point of this process, to try and get away from that. I think there's two kind of realities here. One is that there are actors all over Libya that have influence and control, be that military and security, be that political and over resources. Some of those individuals have the power, if they want to block either a process or elections or to spoil. And I think this plays into the question around, would you see, is it possible to hold elections where the results are accepted rather than disputed as they have been in the past? And that's what I see as one of the potential benefits of this new initiative, is that you do have to somehow seek, I don't necessarily want to say buy-in, but sort of acquiescence that those actors that could act to stop elections don't. And that's a mixture of pressure, assurances, and a conversation around what is needed for that. I agree that actually putting all of these different actors big round together, one big table, probably isn't very effective, but we need to find a sort of more nuanced and careful way of bringing some of those voices in so that they are heard. I hear you, Ahmad, on the 5+5, and I think it was public that there's lots of meetings going on and lots of contacts, and I think we need to have a little bit of patience to wait and see what that grows into. Because the other half of this, and I think some of us have talked about this a great deal, is not allowing any agreement just to be a stitch up between the elites. The whole point I see and why the UK is supportive of this process is because it seeks to bring in a broader set of voices that are already shouting really loudly. You know, I meet civil society actors every week wanting to have their say, wanting to express what they want from a new government. And we need to find a way of formalizing those voices and having them actually affect the process and the roadmap. And so that's the other thing I see as good about this. I totally recognize that whilst it's still undefined, it's very uncertain, but I do think that is the one of the goals behind it, is to broaden out that dialogue. So it's not just an agreement between, you know, 4 or 5, maybe 10 top elites. It's actually making sure that they feel the pressure and they're held to account. And that's where I think the international community has a role, because when it's hard for those voices to be heard, we can shout them, we can hold them up. And I think that's what I see also our job as doing, is as well as the process, it's making sure the outcomes of that process are truly inclusive, because there's a risk we could get a bit tokenistic here. So that's what I see as also a role for the international community. But I just really wanted to emphasize on that point that I think the whole idea behind this is to try and make it less captured by the elite. But it's hard, and yeah, it looks quite messy at the moment, and I think it needs to be further developed.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm conscious that there may be other comments that the panelists would like to make, but perhaps you can address them while addressing the questions. So let's move to the questions from the audience, and let's start with, so anyone who would like to raise a question from the attendees, you can do so again by raising your virtual hand, or we can go to the questions that have been presented already in the question and answer box. And perhaps we start with the question and answer.
One of the questions that has come through is from Ian Martin, and it is this: do you believe that a winner-takes-all election to an executive presidency carries any possibility of uniting Libya under the successful candidate? And that's an open question to any of the panelists.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll take about 3 questions, and then we can do a round with to the panelists.
Another question from an attendee, Otman Gajiji, is this: if there is an election, what is the guarantee that there will be universal acceptance of the results and that the use of force will not be used to recognize the results and the continuation of the status quo? And the third question is 6 months a sufficient time period needed to run an election in Libya, given the current state of affairs?
Thank you. So, Ahmed, I think that I'll direct the question in terms of the guarantee, and obviously anyone else from the panelists on this. This is again a follow-up to the initial question that I posed to you, Ahmed, on what is the guarantee.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to sound repetitive, but at this stage, in order for you to have guarantees, you need to have a better defined process, basically. So there are no guarantees as long as there's no clear outline as to what this process looks like. My worry is, and this is also reflected in the broader set of questions here, is because you don't have a process that is clearly defined and you're just charging forward with this deadline of having elections simultaneous by end year, you are effectively de-technocratizing the discussions that you can have, if that's even a word. You're not allowing the space to have the technical discussions around whether a winner takes all is actually a good system, whether a presidential and parliamentary elections that are simultaneous is a good idea. All of these issues that are really core to the success of the suffrage and to discussing the guarantees around the suffrage are not being discussed. And at this stage, the signals that the UN is giving as to the stakeholders that it will want to include to steer this process forward point to the fact that the discussants will neither be technically equipped nor even ideologically equipped to be having those discussions, because they will aim for a winner takes all type system. So that's why my worry is it will be very similar, as much as we want it to not be. That's why it might be a very similar outcome to the 2021 process. And I go back to timing, the fact that we have more mature systems, more mature politicians, people that know how to navigate or work the UN, work around the UN's plans better. And that's what worries me. You have a hereditary transition now. We thought of Haftar, for instance, as a time-bound problem that will move away once he dies. Now we're going to get stuck with his son. And I don't think that Libya can take another 30 or 40 years of that. And it's similar across the board with many of the other figures. I just point to Haftar considering his longevity and his inevitability, but we have many other figures that are now cultivating their relatives for positions. So we don't want to end up in a Lebanon type system. And I think this is a watershed moment for that reason.
Thank you, Ahmed. Tarek, I'm going to address Ian Martin's question to you around the winner takes all election and whether this carries any possibility of uniting Libya under a successful candidate. And do you think that that's possible?
Thank you. And I think what I'm going to say will echo a lot of what Ahmed was just saying before me. You know, a lot of these conversations and this question on presidential elections or parliamentary elections has been going on for a while now. And I think it's indicative of some of the problems we have of election planning in Libya. So I think that the way that Ian framed the question is very apt, because in a country that's like Libya is today, where you don't have strong political frameworks, cultures, it's coming out of a conflict, it's already divided, that a presidential election creates this winner takes all mentality, especially given the subtle and the not so subtle indications by a host of those who will be competing for presidential elections that they would really like to become the dictator of Libya or the new Gaddafi, rather than just the normal president. But I think this whole thing is putting the cart before the horse, right? You know, we're talking about building a house, and then our first point of discussion is what color of wallpaper should we be using? When we talk about elections, we should be doing this properly and talking from the foundation. So what exactly do we want elections to achieve in Libya? Let's, you know, take one idea out that is often expressed and to say, we would like this to create a stable and unified political representation of the country that is able to complete the transitional process, and then kind of work forward on that basis. So what is the best way in order to achieve these goals? What is the best way to return functional governance, to be able to administratively unify Libya, to be able to resolve the militia issue, to be able to finalize a permanent constitution so that Libya can have predictable and stable governance, restart the rule of law, national reconciliation, and so on. So we put our problems first, and then we work on the solution for them. And the process should be defined on that grounds. Now, if we get to the end of that discussion and we realize, well, actually, you know, perhaps some elements of a presidential system could be good for doing this, as long as that president is tightly constrained, as long as there is a strong mandate for what he is going to achieve and a clear idea of how he's actually going to be constrained, then yeah, perhaps a presidential election starts to make more sense. But what I'm trying to say is that the question of presidential or parliamentary is a bit moot right now. What we should be talking about is what we want elections to achieve and what kind of a political framework we can build to ensure that, you know, regardless of what is appointed or elected, it's not going to become one dictator or 200 dictators, you know, as is the recent experience of parliaments in Libya.
Thank you, Tarek. I'm going to bring in Hanan now to also comment on that. And Hanan, could you also, there was a question raised about, is 6 months enough time for us to bring about elections. And so if you could address that question as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up a little bit from where maybe Tarek stopped. And I would just say that, just to answer the question, of course, there's no guarantee that people will adhere to what they pledged. I mean, people now in power, the current prime minister did not adhere to what he pledged to. Why would we expect anyone to adhere to what they pledge or what they promise? It's not illegal. It's not unlawful to go back on your word. It makes you look a little bit bad, but it's not illegal. The risk of armed, I just want to be clear that the risk of armed confrontations by themselves, that risk by themselves, because that question came up, I believe, from Uthman, that's not a good reason not to hold elections. So you can't say just because there's a risk that there could be confrontations, well, we're not going to hold elections. No. But everything else does need to be in place. And that's, I think, the part that we should maybe expand on just a little bit. I think it's also important to put things into perspective and to understand what it means 6 months from now, because that's exactly where Libya was at last year, at the same time when it was December 24th, such a random date that obviously didn't work. So what's needed to have the conditions in place for a semblance of free and fair elections? I think to truly capture the will of the electorate, in fact, elections need to be free and fair. You can't say that you've captured what Libyans want and to have that a winner takes it all, a bit responding to what Martin asked, without capturing what the largest portion of the Libyan population inside and outside of Libya, in fact, want. And I'm wondering how elections will, how Libya will be able to do that under the current conditions. How will political parties, be able to group when associations are under attack, when basically the government has just decided that everybody's null and void? How are people going to be able to legally meet and legally, group as a political party to work on their political agendas? How will anyone be able to campaign around the country without exposing themselves to serious risk? And I'm not talking about campaigns with massive billboards and so on, but to make it known that that's one part, a key part of an election, is that you put your name out there and you let people know that you are, that you are putting yourself up for elections. How will anyone under the current circumstances ensure that civilians and ordinary residents and citizens, including voters, but also election officials, will be secure going to the polls? And how will Libya, how on earth will the Elections Commission be able to bring in independent elections monitors? How are they going to be able to get access to the country when the government is blocking access to all NGOs and is blocking access, in fact, to any foreigner tied to an NGO? It might be different for foreigners who are coming in on visas to work in the oil sector. Maybe it's a little bit easier for some diplomats, I hear, not for all. But how is it possible to be holding elections, without making sure that independent monitors can actually enter the country and move around to the very remote areas, to the deep south of Libya? These are areas that, we would also like to see. I'm sure people there also want to have their voices heard. So I think that's the part where, you could maybe start to get a little bit nervous about the 6 month, deadline. It was not possible for, just to put it into perspective, the Libya fact-finding mission that ends its mission in May, it was not able to get an approval from the government of national unity and the forces that effectively control the south, and these are not the same, to visit the south of the country. So how is anyone else going to visit the south of the country? This was a high-profile mission and they were not allowed. And more so, how will civic groups, all civil society groups, be able to access areas, including in eastern Libya, areas where a foreigner needs an approval or something called like a security pass from the Libyan Arab Armed Forces to enter eastern Libya? Will they be prepared to issue those for everybody who asks for it? Having been asking for it since 2015 and having been blocked, I can tell you it's not easy. So a human rights space, just to get back to it, because I think that it's important to also know that, elections do need also to have at some level a human rights-based approach. And I'm not naive to the realities on the ground, but a human rights-based approach is really the very bare minimum. It means that somebody can go and cast their vote without being held at gunpoint, with being able to freely do it, without being forced to change their vote, and without being afraid that if they vote for somebody, that they or their families or somebody else is going to get harmed, without this incredible intimidation and pressure that emanates from the armed groups. And last but not least, an election also needs a functioning court system, because who really is going to referee and who is going to make sure that, once you have accusations or allegations of voter fraud, or people are refusing to enforce the results of an election, are refusing to count those remaining votes, who is going to enforce that? I'll leave it there and happy to take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanan. I think you raised some very important points and a lot of questions that still need to be answered around this political process. We'll go back to the audience, but I do want to kind of use my moderator authority to just pose a question to Caroline around the civil society crackdown. And Hanan raised that. You responded by saying that this is something that it has been raised at the highest levels when meeting with the government. And so I think that what we need is more than just raising. This is a absolutely critical segment of society. It is absolutely essential to the democratic process, to the political process that is being discussed today, and to that path of leading us to elections. And what possibilities in terms of conditionality, if you will, even in terms of participating in this political process, are not, or could be imposed or on the authorities to ensure a backpedal on what is happening to civil society. I think that the government today absolutely needs to understand that civil society is a vital part of that process, irrespective of the other challenges that activists and human rights defenders face on the ground. The government needs to do more to protect them rather than actually be the one attacking. And is conditionality a possibility?
It's a good question, because I 100% agree. I mean, a vibrant civil society and a free civil society is critical to enable any stable democracy and process. If we want Libya to succeed, then civil society must play a leading role in that. In terms of conditionality directly between what we're seeing with this specific crackdown on NGOs and the political process, it's difficult to predict that at the moment, as I said, because I think there will be different groups involved in different conversations around this. So I'm hesitant to draw a direct link there. But what I would say is that I can't speak for the rest of the international community, but for the UK, we now have independent sanctions regimes and things like that look specifically at human rights. And it's something I think we should be thinking about carefully in Libya, because I don't speak for Libyans, but there was a revolution in 2011 seeking more freedom, seeking more autonomy, seeking fairer treatment, across the whole country. And these steps are taking Libya in completely the wrong direction.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm now going to open the question to Mr. Salah al-Bakoush, who has his hand raised. So if you want to come in, Mr. Salah, and present your question. If you can unmute, Mr. Salah. Okay. I mean, we can't hear, so we can move on to some of the written questions until we can sort out, until we can get Mr. Salah back on.
Okay, while we're waiting for that, I've got 3 more questions lined up from audience members, and the first one is this. What is the perception and/or expectation of women's participation in an election, both regarding candidates and in voter participation? The second question is from Peter Millett, and he asks, the SRSG appeared to set a deadline of June to agree on the election laws, but what happens if there fails to be an agreement by this time? And the third question is from Patrick Stevens, who asks, what value do you place on institution and system building? Does this help ready Libya if there is progress, or is it ineffective and could be considered window dressing?
Thank you. Perhaps, Caroline, we can come back to you on women's participation.
Absolutely, thank you. That feels like, I don't know, a positive thing to be able to talk about. Now, I think it's really important. And again, like one of the things I've tried to bring to my time here is really learning the lessons, not just from Libya, but elsewhere. And again, we've learned time and time again that unless women are part of both the process and they were able to fully participate as candidates and as voters, it's not a sustainable solution. So, for example, we're working with the High National Elections Commission's unit that looks to work and support women's participation. We have some projects going, looking at supporting gender equality across the country. I don't want to say too much because of safeguarding concerns, to be frank. But I think, it's something that we absolutely want to see. So yes, essentially, I think it's going to be really important. I think the final thing I'd say is, as I've mentioned before, one of the things that's really important to me personally is to make sure this isn't just about numbers of women at the table. It's actually about making sure that the outcomes of processes reflect the concerns and the needs of women. And so it is meaningful. As I said, it's easy for processes sometimes to become a bit tokenistic. And I've experienced that in other political processes around the world. So that's something that we'll be working really hard to avoid, to see those outcomes be inclusive of women's interests.
Thank you. Hanan, can I bring you in on this as well in terms of ensuring, we know that women have struggled to gain high-level decision-making positions within this process, and in terms of participating in the political process, presenting themselves as candidates for elections. There has been a particular attack on women. Hanan, I'm going to ask you what safeguards should be put in place to ensure that equal participation and ensure that women are equally part of this process.
Thank you for that question. I think, if we take a bit of a wider look and take into account a little bit what we discussed about the framework of any possible elections happening in this short period of time, I think that, we do need to agree here that there cannot be a sustainable path to democracy or to a democratic state building, before democracy, without an inclusive approach. And with inclusive approach, it really means bringing together Libyans of all walks of life, because people have different views on what their democracy and, what their future should look like. And my best friend in Libya, in fact, once told me there's 6.5 million Libyans, so there's 6.5 million opinions out there on this issue. And I think that he's very right about that people really, have their own ideas and their own views on how they see their future. So this inclusive approach of elections needs to include women as the 50% of the population. Again, not as the window dressing or as this quota that, you know, somebody will agree to. In the last elections law, it was a 30% quota. And I can't wrap my head around why 50% of the population should get a 30% quota. But okay, you know, and I'm not, I want to be clear that I'm not speaking for a quota system. I'm just saying that, you know, when you agree to a quota, you're agreeing to a certain kind of representation. These are things that, you know, women's groups, you know, need to discuss, and they need to agree, you know, how they want to move forward. Do they want to move forward with a system like that or not? You know, will they accept this kind of representation or not? And these are the kinds of debates that happen in a civil society. This is exactly where NGOs you know, are sitting around the table and debating and coming up with policy recommendations for what it is that they want to see in an elections law. And this is something that from today's point of view is obviously not possible. But an inclusive approach, you know, doesn't mean only, you know, one that includes women. It also needs to include other segments of a society, people with disabilities. How can you be sure that, you know, people with disabilities, especially in the remote areas, will have access to the information that they need in the way that they can consume it and have access to actually go to the polls? These are important issues. These are not like minor issues where you can say, oh, we'll work on this in the next elections. I don't think that that's the case. Then there are whole segments of the population, including displaced people, people who are forcibly displaced, and people who are displaced because of conflict, people who don't have access to the civil registry, people who are unable to retrieve their registration papers. You also need to be able to make sure that these people, one way or another, at least have a chance to access and to participate in the elections. And then the bigger issue, which has been a disaster from the first elections, is, you know, how do you involve the Libyan diaspora? And there is a large part of the Libyan population in the diaspora that also wants to actively participate in these elections. And can you ensure that a good number of them, at least, are able to access the election? One last word on, because that came up and you mentioned it in your comment, Marwa, is that really there has been a consistent attack on women in the public sphere. And we have seen this in the last few years, where anybody who has a public role, and it doesn't matter what that role is, whether that person, quite frankly, is an artist or that person is a politician, the amount of misogynistic and hateful attacks that women are subjected to in real life, but also online, are remarkable. And, you know, I have not seen that anyone in the government of national unity or the other government vying for legitimacy, or, you know, the other bodies that effectively control territory in Libya and have responsibilities towards people that live in those territories, I have not seen that this issue has been taken up seriously. On the contrary, I have seen that a cybercrime law, a hugely abusive and problematic law that was promulgated last year, is now in effect. And now the Deputy Interior Minister, Faraj Gaim, in Eastern Libya, a few weeks ago decided to arrest a couple of women because they were out of line with what, you know, is considered acceptable for public morals. That might be the case, might not be the case. But the problem here is the use and abuse of the judiciary and the use and abuse of, you know, judicial procedures, and using these incredibly abusive laws, which basically mean that you can't type out a word unless somebody approved it. And I think, you know, this again puts into perspective, you know, prospects for free and fair elections 6 months down the line.
Thank you, Hanan. I'm conscious of time. We are quickly running out of time, although this is a very interesting conversation that we're having. So I'll try to just get to this one last question, and then I want to kind of wrap up and give any of the panelists any final words and thoughts that they want to share. And I would address this to Tarek. The election laws, the SRSG has placed a deadline for the election laws for June this year. And the question is, what happens if this is not met?
Probably the same thing that happened the last 3 or 4 times that this hasn't been met. We try and figure out a new way to get an election law on a constitutional basis. I mean, I really hope that perhaps this next time the penny will drop amongst everybody, and it will just become completely inarguable to say that we can entrust the House of Representatives and the High Council of State to come up with an election law on a constitutional basis, to come up with any election law, let alone one that could be valid and capable of actually progressing the country, because they have made it abundantly clear that their interest is in preserving their jobs and in preserving or growing their power. So what will happen? Hopefully, as I said, that penny will drop and it will create more impetus behind an alternative mechanism through which to create an election law on a constitutional basis. And again, I hope that this mechanism, this broader panel, can start doing things the right way. So to have this conversation about what it is that we want elections to achieve in Libya, what kind of frameworks do we need to be building, what kind of cultures do we need to be cultivating and protecting, and then coming up with a list of jobs for how we can get there. And a list of asks as well from the internationals and others involved in the process, because things like, carving out the space for civil society cannot just be done by Libyans alone in an environment where 6.5 million normal Libyans are being oppressed by a few hundred or 1,000 plus max politicians and people with guns. So yeah, hopefully hopefully this is what will happen afterwards, and I'll pass it back so I don't take up too much time.
Thank you. Ahmed, you seem to have some thoughts on this as well. What are your thoughts in terms of what will happen come June?
What I was thinking as well, that's one very elusive penny that Tarek is talking about. Seems to be quite a few times that this has happened. So I honestly am I've grown apathetic like a lot of Libyans, so I don't honestly see this awakening happening. And I think a lot of the politicians also realize that, unfortunately, there's no consequence to them failing. So they don't operate within the confines of the timelines that are given to them. They've called the UN's bluff a few times. They were quite stressed this time around. But if you keep giving them leeway, then they'll simply abuse that. And that's what's been happening over and over again over the past years. And it's a bit frustrating that it's not even different institutions. We're talking about effectively the same people for almost a decade now, which is quite frustrating. Now on the point on civil society, I also wanted to echo what everyone has said. Really, I think it should be one of the biggest priorities at this stage. And I'd also like to say that sometimes I think both the UN and policymakers don't realize the impact that their PR or public imaging or pictures that they post, etc., have to the population and have on basically sanitizing the some of these figures, etc. When you see pictures of the UN meeting commanders or armed group members that everyone knows, it's very well documented that they are responsible not just for financial crime, etc., but even almost effectively war crimes or war crime perpetrators, that has an impact. And it has an impact not just on the psyche of the local population, but it also has an impact on their ability to leverage that. So if you're meeting with someone, maybe try not to take pictures with them smiling in some cases. And this is a PSA for everyone. Last but not least, on civil society, I remember last year there were quite a few forays of even the SRSG trying to meet with individuals. And it's not a good look if you're meeting so-called civil society activists in a sanitized forum where the LAF eagle is very publicly displayed behind that's not exactly sends a great message about civil society. And it's the same thing. I think I would also say that to for example, the Presidential Council's reconciliation initiative, which seems to has diluted really the importance of what reconciliation means in Libya and has reduced it to these extravagant stages where select civil society activists that will sing the praises of certain political figures are included. So I think, yeah, when you are a policymaker or you are working with the UN, you should be careful about putting conditionalities on your engagement and put very clear boundaries on where your funding, etc., is supposed to go. It's ironic to me that a lot of the civil society organizations, etc., there's been very stringent requirements for them to be registered in Libya, etc., have all their paperwork in order, when you know who is behind some of these institutions and what the risk is. And now I think if the penny has dropped, it has dropped at the level of that. You need to amend that ecosystem, and there should be significant pressure placed on the politicians and the armed groups involved to really let the civil space operate. You cannot move forward with elections without having that happen. They simply won't work. We're setting the stage for them either to be illegitimate or to fail in the lead up. So I'll leave it at that on this rather bleak note, but sorry.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you for kind of also raising these very, very important elements around civil society that somehow became the theme of our discussion today, the importance of civil society and the role that they have to play in this process and Libya's future stability. We are 3 minutes out, and so I just want to quickly wrap up. If any of our panelists have a very quick 30-second final word that they'd like to share, I hand over to you, but really, really short, so that we can wrap up. Thank you. I'll start with Hanan.
Okay, I have a very short one. You've been listening very patiently to us for about an hour. You've heard us talk about how NGOs are being scapegoated and how the situation is dire. But if you walk away with maybe one thought today, let it be a thought that I give you. It should be that really Libya cannot fall off the international scrutiny map, because really this is what everybody in Libya currently, this political elite wants you and is counting on you to get disinterested in the situation. The situation has calmed down, small businesses are up and running, the oil is flowing, everything's normalized, everything is fine. But really, is that enough? Is entrenched warlordism and perpetual conflict really the way forward? Libya cannot fall off the map, and there needs to be continuous scrutiny of its human rights records, be it at the Human Rights Council, be it at the Security Council, be it through monitoring through the presence of civic groups, domestic and international groups. It cannot fall off the map, and that needs to be continuously reported on. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanan. Thank you. I'll go to Caroline and then Tarek and Ahmed, but really, really brief.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say that offers me the perfect way also to wrap up, just to say, please be assured that Libya matters to the UK. There's a reason we reopened our embassy last year, and that, yes, Libya, for Libyans' sake, but also, quite frankly, Libya is in Europe's near neighborhood. What happens in Libya really matters to us, and we want long-term sustainable stability and solutions in exactly the way you and everyone on this panel has described.
Thank you, Caroline. Tarek?
Thanks very much. What I wanted to quickly say is that we've all spent so long today talking about the elections themselves or the process itself, but I wanted to remind us all of the ramifications of this. I think that there's an overwhelming impression that this is kind of the last chance to make this UN system work, to make this UN process work, to make these kind of elections work. And we see even behind the scenes, people are kind of settling into a new status quo. And we see this internationally and within Libya itself. Deals are being signed with various governments. People are treating the country as de facto divided already. These cultures that we talk about are being embedded. We talk of a divide, but both East and West are moving pretty much in sync in terms of cracking down on civil society and so on. So we see a new Libya that is formalizing, which I think those in charge would like it to look very much like the old Libya, the pre-revolution Libya. And so I really fear that if we don't get things right this time, then the consequences will be dire. There is a lot at stake. There is the hopes of 6.5 million Libyans in this process. And so, yeah, as much as we focus on the elections itself, we shouldn't lose sight of the gravity of the situation, and we should use that to kind of fuel this push for elections to make sure it's right, even if it does take longer than 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Imed, a final thought very quickly.
I don't have a lot to say. I realize we're over time, so thank you all. I hope that by this time next year we'll be discussing the challenges of a newly elected government, parliament, president, etc. But hopefully, yeah, we'll get there. But thank you again for the invitation, to you and to all my co-panelists and to everyone that listened in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Imed. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our audience. Sorry if we weren't able to get through all the questions, but I do hope that we can all leave here today with a bit of food for thought in terms of the realities, and actually take this on for those that are working on this actively on this file, to put these thoughts into consideration when working on Libya's path forward. And we will for sure as well. So thank you all. And with that, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.